you so much, everyone. Thank you, Fazila, our chair, for the introduction. So for us on the part of PMG, we're invited by IFAA to prepare a report that looks at the Parliament's response to the State Capture Commission recommendations to date, since the time it was released to date. So the review that we published today, that we're publishing today, is the basis of the presentation that I'll take you through just now. So in a nutshell, the first slide will just be a highlight of PMG's work. I think Fazila did a wonderful job with introducing our work. So yeah, I'll skip that. And then yes, just to give an overview of what our review is about, which is an account of what Parliament has done since Chief Justice Zondo released his findings and recommendations. And we also, in the review, present our views on how the institution can strengthen its oversight processes, with particular focus on the committee system. So mindful that the sixth Parliament is drawing to a close next year, 2024. There will be a new Parliament, the seventh Parliament. We thought this is an opportune time just to reflect on the oversight work of Parliament, and in the same vein, hopefully inform and strengthen the institution for the next Parliament. And then, just to give a background, so last year, before Zondo released his final report, PMG published a review of Parliament's oversight, pointing to institutional weaknesses, which prompted Judge Zondo to ask where Parliament was when state capture gripped South Africa. So broadly speaking, Zondo, as we all know, put forward that weaknesses in parliamentary oversight and executive accountability had over time contributed to corruption and maladministration, and then subsequently he made recommendations, especially around improving oversight within Parliament and this accountability function. Broadly, I think Zondo made 10 key recommendations, which included procedures concerning House resolutions emanating from oversight activities, executive attendance of parliamentary committee meetings, as well as plenary sessions, the selection of public office bearers and their competence and their ethical conduct. And also he also made recommendations around the establishment of an oversight committee on vote one, which is the president and the presidency. And then he also made recommendations around the appointment of committee chairpersons, where Parliament might explore making appointments from opposition parties as well. So yeah, I won't delve into all of that at this present moment. So just to give an overview of the background of how things panned out before Zondo produced his final report in June 2022. We are mindful that there was a lot of pressure on Parliament from the opposition, civil society, and others for Parliament to urgently deal with the recommendations. And then later, Parliament received legal advice that there was nothing stopping MPs from processing the State Capture Commission reports, because initially Parliament was of the view that they have to wait for the President to first lay out his implementation plan before they could proceed with their processes. So at that time, Parliament did receive a legal advice to say they might have to deal with all the recommendations that are flowing from other reports before the final one was published. So it was later communicated in respect of issues that related specifically to MPs who were mentioned in Part 3, Part 1, and Part 2 of Part 1 of the reports should be referred to the Joint Committee on Ethics and Members' Interest for processing. And then subsequently, the President submitted his implementation plan in October 2022, and then a month later, Parliament commenced with these processes around processing the Commission's report. So yes, the next slide, we just highlight that the NA rules first convened in November of 2022 last year, and then they adopted a 31-page implementation plan which identified structures or designated structures that will report quarterly to the houses of both committees, of both the NA and NSOP. And then, according to the plan that was adopted, recommendations will be forwarded to the appropriate committees in both houses. And then beyond these committees, specifically the NA rules, NSOP rules, and the Joint Rules Committee, there are also other 15 committees which were identified to oversee the implementation of the President's plans in response to the Commission's recommendations. And then, so this slide is just a highlight and overview of the various designated structures that were set up by Parliament to process the recommendations, particularly relating to parliamentary oversight and accountability. So I won't give a blow by blow account of these, but suffice to say, Parliament's response to the recommendations is two-pronged. So there's a response to the recommendations on Parliament's functioning on one hand, and then a response to the recommendations to the executive, which are addressed in the President's plan that was published by the Presidency in October last year. And then we also note that these designated committees were expected to submit reports on their progress on a biannual basis. So every 6 months they were expected to submit their response, their progress in as far as the processing of the recommendations was concerned. And then we also note as PMG that most of the progress that we have witnessed with Parliament dealing with recommendations has happened in the second term of Parliament. So from the beginning of the year up to April, there wasn't much. We saw much of the progress and much of the activity around that in the second term of Parliament, which is from 18 April to 15 June when the NA was due to go on recess last week. So also we also note that the bulk of the recommendations have been dealt with by the NA Rules Subcommittee. So the NA Rules Committee set up a subcommittee to process the recommendations relating to oversight and accountability, and most of these recommendations have been processed. Some the Parliament has rejected, some has accepted, some it has thrown the can down the road, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then I'll just highlight a few recommendations and what the Commission decided and what Parliament has said and how it has processed those recommendations. I'll just highlight a few out of the 10 that we highlighted in the designated structures. So we note that Zondo recommended that Parliament should consider whether it would be desirable for it to establish a committee whose function will be to oversee the President and the Presidency of Vote 1 in Parliament's balance, which existing committees currently do not oversee. So the parties that sit in the NA Rules Subcommittee that I mentioned earlier proposed different approaches when they processed this recommendation, which are as follows. So there was one option. One option they proposed that there should be further research that should be done on the part of Parliament to see whether it is indeed desirable for Parliament to set up such a committee and what its mandate will encompass. And then this second option was that, yes, Parliament should indeed establish such a committee. And then the third option was for the Rules Committee and Parliament to endorse, and in principle endorsement that the executive's activities must be subject to examination, and also those falling under the Presidency. So at the end of it all, Parliament decided to go with the first option, and then it was announced mid-July by the Speaker that members will embark on a study tour, I think, to the UK, just to get a sense of how a committee on the Presidency would work. Yeah, of course, in the UK, there's a liaisons committee that oversees the Prime Minister. But yeah, that's what was decided by Parliament. And then with the other recommendation that we just thought it would be suffice to highlight is that on the appointment of committee chairpersons, where Zondo, the Chief Justice Zondo, recommended that committee chairpersons should include more members from opposition parties. So when this recommendation when this recommendation was discussed by the NA Rules Committee, we note that there was strong pushback against this recommendation, particularly from the majority party, with some MPs even accusing the Commission of overreach. So, yeah, they found that Chief Justice Zondo having to suggest that opposition parties should also form part of the chairperson's structure was not the way to go. So they rejected that proposal in April, on April 25. And then also in our report, in our review, we also just given our very own analysis on how we think things should be and how things are. So we just highlight that there are other creative means of exploring this recommendation, which we feel Parliament might have missed, such as having an opposition MP chair certain committee meetings, not having to be a permanent chair, and also maybe having chairpersonship being on a rotational basis throughout the parliamentary cycle. And then the other recommendation that we thought it suffice to highlight is the one where Chief Justice Zondo recommended that Parliament should consider highlighted that the appointment of certain compromised people and prominent in prominent leadership positions within the justice system led to the manipulation of these agencies and to the harmful effects of these politically motivated appointments. So Zondo felt that Parliament should look into that and have robust rules that will ensure that people that are compromised and whose ethical conduct is not clean should not be considered for public office appointments. So in its report, the NA Rules Committee recognized that the question of legislative review might fall outside this immediate scope, but advised that proper guidance to support proceedings relating to sexual appointments are necessary. So in our review, we give our own perspective to say we are aware that most of these rules around appointments are mostly conventional, and they are mostly just in terms of practice, but also embedding them in the rules and making sure that they are institutionalized would help and do a great deal in standardizing the processes and making sure that those who might be compromised don't find themselves in such positions. And then the fourth recommendation around parliamentary oversight and accountability that we want to highlight was where the Commission recommended that Parliament should consider whether introducing a constituency-based electoral system will strengthen oversight. And then it further recommended that the Constitution be changed to allow for the President to be directly elected. So this recommendation is being processed by the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs and the Select Committee on Security and Justice. So as we might all be aware, there's been movement in the implementation of this recommendation, although the process was not initiated by Parliament itself, but following the enactment of the Electoral Amendment Bill. So last week, 2 weeks back on June 9, the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs received an update from the Department of Home Affairs on where things are at in relation to the Electoral Amendment Act. And they were informed that the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel was dealing with this particular recommendation. So this panel, the electoral reform consultation panel, was established by the Electoral Amendment Act. And then linked to the previous recommendation would be around protecting MPs from losing party membership and their seats in Parliament by law. I won't delve into this one because it's linked to the previous recommendation. So we also recognize the work that has been done by the Joint Committee on Ethics and Members' Interests from the time the Commission released its report to date. So this committee, this committee is not part of the structures processing those 10 recommendations that I did highlight earlier, but it dealt with the breaching of the ethics code by current MPs as a result of the revelations that we saw through the Zondo inquiry. So Parliament's legal division recommended last year in May already, just say a month before the final report was published, that the ethics committee consider whether certain MPs that had breached the ethics code, how they will be processed. So I think Joe might touch on that during this presentation as well. So on 25 May, 2 months back, it was announced by the Secretary to the NA that 3 of those MPs were cleared. And then also in March 2023, the Ethics Committee highlighted that they had issued reprimands to two MPs, that is the Deputy Minister in the Presidency, Pinky Kekana, as well as former Mineral Resources Mosebenzi Zwane. So in our review, also just give our own perspective and just highlighting that we believe the ethics, the issue around ethics is quite layered. So while some MPs might be investigated and cleared, and others have been found in breach of the ethics code and sanctioned, we find that some continue in their positions. So perhaps it might be less of an issue for Parliament institutionally to deal with those MPs, but more for the political parties to take a strong line on the retaining of seats for such MPs. But that is explored more in our paper. And then we turn on to how Parliament is overseeing the President's response plan. So the President's response plan focuses on the recommendations that are directed to the executive and those that affect his work. So in line with these 15 committees were identified to undertake this task. So the specific matters they will be overseeing are wide-ranging and include criminal investigations and prosecutions, asset recoveries, reforms to prevent future occurrence of state capture, and also broader systemic reforms arising from the work of the Commission. So last year in November, the NA Rules Committee agreed that the relevant committees processing these will have a deadline of 6 months to implement the recommendations, or at least release a preliminary report on their work. So as part of this review that we undertook, we reached out to a number of people within Parliament, and also we did some check and search from media reports. So from what we have uncovered, and also we did contact some of the committee secretaries within Parliament. So from what we have uncovered, many committees seem not to have done much work in relation to this, and we cannot confirm if they met the June deadline that was set by the NA Rules Committee last year. And also we know that out of these 15 committees that were tasked with overseeing the President's response plan, we only were able to establish that 2 did submit their quarterly update reports, that namely the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs, as well as the Portfolio Committee on Public Service and Administration. And then there are 2 other committees, the Portfolio Committee on Trade, Industry and Competition, as well as Police, which met last week, just before the Parliament went on recess, to discuss their implementation plan around this and to give effect to Chief Justice Zondo's recommendations. And then also our review, we also discuss some insights on the committee system and how we believe Parliament might wish to explore those in terms of strengthening, in an effort to strengthen their oversight and accountability mandate. So in our review last year already, we touched on some of the institutional weaknesses that frustrate effective oversight and how this can be addressed. So some of these points are also repeated in this section of the review. And then we also note that when considering the recommendations in their totality, there are some complex big issue recommendations, but also there are also a number of small quick wins that committees might want to begin implementing and putting into practice independently. And we also highlight how Parliament can spruce up their tracking systems and ensure that they hold follow-up meetings, just to make sure that things don't fall, issues don't fall by the wayside in their processing. And then we also you suggest that Parliament might also assist parliamentary committees to set up subcommittees to deal with specific issues and to also make sure that whatever they are processing, the processes are expedited. And then we conclude our review by highlighting that the processes relating to the implementation of Zondo's recommendations have only gotten underway. As I noted, that most of the progress that we've witnessed has been during the second term of Parliament. So it is not possible for us to really make a definitive assessment of the impact these processes have had so far. So we also know that while much work has gone into identifying structures, reporting mechanisms, and other procedural considerations, some of which I've highlighted already, our overall sense is that the implementation of the recommendations has been a tick box exercise and a missed opportunity in some respects. So reflecting on Parliament's oversight mandate and accountability mandate, broadly speaking, we also make an assessment that Parliament's performance in those respects has been mixed, and we illustrate this by way of a few examples. For example, Parliament's decision to reject the independent panel's report on the Pala matter, and which has been widely criticized by civil society and the public at large, which we view as an example of oversight failure. And then on the opposite end, we also recognize Parliament's approach in terms of the ESCOM investigations and the deliberations that have been done by the Parliament so far, particularly the SCOPA, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, and also matters brought forward by civil society. For instance, the Unite Behind Ethics Committee issue. So there's been processes around dealing with those. So we recognize that on the other hand, there's been some bit of progress. So we also emphasize that while there are pockets of progress and excellence, when Parliament fails on the big matters, so it just overshadows everything and all the work that it will have done. And then in our parting shot, we emphasize and indicate that civil society, us as civil society, we need to be vigilant and be a vocal voice in supporting effective oversight and enhancing Parliament's oversight and accountability mandate. And through that, we can use various tools. We have our Right to Parliament tool that is hosted by our second website, the People's Assembly, that enables the public to submit their inputs to committees directly. And those are some of the ways that people can proactively influence the work of Parliament. So yes, this is what we had prepared for this event. Thank you so much.
So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Can everyone see? Should I move to the side a little bit? No, we're good. Yeah, I'm Joseph Mason, the legal officer and director of Unite Behind. Unite Behind started in 2017. One of the founders was Zaki Ahmad. He unfortunately couldn't be here today. We've got a very important march protesting the poor state of the Guguletu Day Hospital. And yeah, so today I think we sort of got a bit more of a bigger picture with Sabelo's talk. I'll be focusing more on our experience working with, we submitted 6 complaints against MPs to the Joint Ethics Committee, which I'll just call the Ethics Committee, last year. And so yes, we'll be focusing in on our experience on that. I think I should just add the caveat that I'm no expert. There are many greater experts, especially with regarding the Joint Ethics Committee here in the room today, and I really appreciate everyone's inputs and advice, I guess, on how to deal with our complaints further. But yeah, I think we can give some good insight from our experience in these cases. So first, we're here with DECODE. I'm going to speak about DECODE of conduct, and just give a basic outline. So the code of conduct governs all MPs. They must adhere to these principles, which are fairly nebulous, although they are defined a little bit in the code: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, openness, honesty, and leadership. I think at first glance also there are some key things missing here. There isn't anything to do with efficiency or effectiveness. Yeah, I think there are various other gaps there, but I think I'll deal with that later. So MPs have to abide by the principles, rules, and obligations of the code. They must uphold the law.
The primary architect of state capture, as Prasa, in our opinion, was
their obligations in terms of the Constitution. They have to maintain public confidence and trust in the integrity of Parliament. And they have to commit to the eradication of all forms of discrimination. So our complaints focused on contraventions of clause 4.1 of the code, which is what I've just read through there at various points. And this, if there's a contravention of clause 4.1, that constitutes a breach of the code in terms of clause 10. And so we submitted a complaint. The complaints procedure goes thus. After the submission, the registrar of the committee, in this case the acting registrar, communicates the complaint to the respondent MP within 7 days of the receipt of the complaint. After receiving the complaint, the MP has to submit a response to the registrar after 7 days after they received it. And then the registrar assesses the complaints and makes a recommendation to the committee, the ethics committee. There's no timeline connected with this. The code does say that complaints must be dealt with promptly, with promptness, but there's no absolute timeline here. Then the committee has the following options after they've reviewed the recommendation by the registrar. They can accept the recommendation, they can reject the report in whole or in part, and they can determine if it requires further investigation and whether a hearing should be held or not. If the committee finds that there has been a breach of the code, then they have to make a recommendation on what penalty is appropriate. And then this recommendation is voted on by the respective house of the MP. Such penalties include a formal reprimand, a fine, a reduction in wages, and a suspension from parliamentary duties. But harsher penalties can be imposed if the committee finds that the member has breached the ethical principles that I read out before. And it has done so recently with Mosebenzi Zwane and Joe Masonganyi, who I'll speak about in a bit. So the code also requires the committee to continue its investigation to make a finding, even if the MP has resigned or has left Parliament after the complaint has been made. I'm not sure if this is showing up properly, but okay. So the Constitution requires that I won't go through it all, but it requires that Parliament and its committees conduct their business in an open manner and hold their meetings in public, and may not exclude the public from sittings of the committee unless it is reasonable and justifiable to do so in an open and democratic society. And this will become relevant later, as we'll see in our experience with these complaints. So why did we submit our complaints? Unite Behind has two main campaigns. We focus on fixing PRASA, fix our trains, and on fixing ESCOM, our electricity action campaign, which is much younger and less fully formed. So in our Fix Our Trains campaign, we obviously studied the State Capture Commission of Enquiry, and particularly Part 4, which I forget which chapter, deals with PRASA and state capture at PRASA. And the report details in great detail the mismanagement of PRASA and how it was captured. And the capture at PRASA was slightly different to the rest of state capture in South Africa, in that it was captured by a local cabal, not the Guptas, and not connected to outside interests really. And the mismanagement at PRASA, as I'll go through, started with Parliament, and many of the people who were at PRASA then graduated to and involved in state capture, graduated to Parliament rather than being held accountable. This is
So I think, the primary architect of state capture at PRASA, in our opinion, was today.
He approved hundreds of corrupt contracts. He was, we think, responsible for billions of rands in corruption. And the National Treasury held investigations into him after the Public Protector's derailed report. Well, not just into him, but into, I think it was 200 and something contracts, over 10 million at PRASA between 2010 and 2015, 2012 and 2015. And he was found to have been suspect in these investigations in terms of 30 contracts. And they recommended that he be criminally charged for this involvement. The State Capture Commission of Enquiry repeated these findings and recommended that he be investigated and criminally charged as well. He is now the chair of the Standing Committee on Appropriations, holding a massive amount of power. So we felt it was necessary to go after him. Perhaps we shouldn't have in this manner, as I'll go into in a bit. But not that we shouldn't have gone after him, but perhaps we shouldn't have used this mechanism. Then Joe Masonganyi, he was the former Minister of Transport. He's now the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance. I won't go too much into the rest of them. I think I've taken up enough time, and we should focus on the parliamentary issues. But he unlawfully dismissed the Molefe board, which was the only board that was actually doing good in the past decade, more than a decade at PRASA. And he tried to undertake these unlawful negotiations with Chinese officials for the Malota Rail Development Corridor, which was fraught with procurement problems. He illegally appointed an interim board, and which was headed by Judge Makubele, who we also have a JSC complaint against. And it's now at the stage of the Judicial Conduct Tribunal, and that'll conclude at the end of August. But we think there's pretty good evidence that's been led so far into how she, into her maladministration at PRASA while she was chair, and also as a judge. So I think basically Joe Masongani didn't take action when we wrote to him and various other PCOTs, portfolio committees on transport. They took no action when we submitted reams of information about what is going on at PRASA. Mosebenzi Zwane, that complaint didn't relate to any of his conduct to do with PRASA, but he was, at the time when we submitted the complaint, chair of the Portfolio Committee on Transport. And so we felt it necessary, because he was connected to PRASA in that way, we had to submit a complaint about him. His misconduct has been widely reported in the media, with the Frede dairy farm at Eskom, etc., and was greatly impugned in the State Capture Commission of Enquiry. And so we used basically just the State Capture Commission of Enquiry findings as our complaint against him. Dipuo Peters, she was the former Minister of Transport. She's now with Buthelezi in the Standing Committee on Appropriations. She contributed to the instability at PRASA, and she personally used PRASA buses for an ANC event and either didn't pay or didn't follow procurement processes. Tikileri Magatsi also obstructed Popo Molefe's board. Zondo found that she had a total lack of understanding of corruption and failed in her oversight duties. And then Fikile Mbalula, who was the former Minister of Transport, engaged in irregular appointments at PRASA, unlawfully dismissed the board, unlawfully appointed an administrator, which we had to go to court against and managed to stop that from happening. And despite various court rulings, he failed to rectify his actions, allowing further misconduct. There are also findings against him by the public protector, both while he was Minister of Sports and Recreation and also while he was Minister of Transport. So we submitted the complaints in September of 2022. The committee made its first decisions only 8 months later, in April. And we wrote, I think, 3 or 4 different times. 2 of those were letters of demands to the registrar and the committee, asking for updates, asking for any information on what was being done with our complaints. At what stage were they? We just got stonewalled. They said, internal processes are underway, and the committee meetings are confidential, and basically not providing us with any information. They didn't meet between November and March, so that's 4 months of no meetings. That's a third of the year without any meetings with we think an incredibly important committee. So as a result, we took them to court in April 2023. We submitted an application to compel them to decide on our complaints, to take prompt action, and we challenged the constitutionality of the code's confidentiality clauses. The code keeps the process confidential right from when this complaint is submitted all the way until the decision is made. And it doesn't provide for adequate reasons to be shown by the committee for its decisions, you don't get a record of decision, or you get a one-liner basically on what has happened with your complaint. On the day that we submitted our court papers, the committee then sent us a letter that the previous day they had made decisions regarding Buthelezi, Mbalula, Zwane, and Magadzi. They dismissed all of those, and then they still had to decide about Maswangani and Peters. This is part of the letter that we received. So their reasoning around Mbalula and Magadzi was that they had resigned in March, but this was after we submitted the complaint. And according to the code, they must still complete their investigations. So this is clearly wrong. And then, against Swiss Buthelezi here, he only became an MP after he was chairperson at PRASA. And while we didn't like to believe it, I think we have to concede that the code doesn't apply to conduct before one becomes an MP. And perhaps that's correct as well, in terms of principles of retrospectivity and fairness. I think it's clear from this that the code isn't the right tool to use for past misconduct. And then in respect of Zwane, it seems that they didn't really read our complaint here. Our complaint had nothing to do with his conduct at PRASA. Our complaint was related to his conduct as a Minister of Mineral Resources. And so they closed the file, but it seems they didn't read our complaint properly. And then, Peters and Maswangani complaints were still being decided. Then recently, on the 13th of June, regarding Joe Maswangani, it seems he only made representations to them on the 5th of May, 2023. He had 5 days after we submitted on the 12th of September, 7 days to respond after he received our response. So by the end of September, he should have responded. But it seems they still entertained his response. I think they are within their rights to do so. And we achieved some partial success here in that the committee recommended that the House impose the following sanction: that he suspended from his seats in all parliamentary debates and sittings, and from committee meetings and committee-related functions and operations from 10 October 2023 to the 1st of December 2023. So he's basically suspended for 2 months. They also had the option to issue a fine, a reprimand, deduct salary during this time, but they didn't do so. So basically he's getting a holiday for 2 months. And with full pay, it looks like. And he doesn't have to submit an apology, which is a fairly common requirement that the committee has in many of the other complaints. And he doesn't have to, he's not been reprimanded as well. So I've identified problems and gaps in the code and the committee's procedure. Again, I'm no expert, and I'd love input here further. I think I already have one from Sabelos. Speech. So I think it's clear that the code, without having timelines or deadlines around much of its processes, allows for extensive delays, and we've experienced that. I think the Zwane decision that came out in March of this year, that complaint was submitted in 2017. 6 years later, they came to the decision. They have the incorrect application of the code. Clearly, the code applies to MPs who have resigned if we submit the complaint while they're still an MP. There's no provision for updates or adequate reasons provided to complainants. And the code doesn't apply to conduct before MPs join Parliament. I say, perhaps this is correct, but perhaps there should be, and I think I'll get into this, another sort of mechanism where Parliament can provide oversight, self-oversight over MPs who joined Parliament for previous misconduct. The Code and the committee are not really equipped, I think. They're not fit for purpose to deal with serious misconduct, for instance, corruption. The sanctions, I think, that are provided are too weak. I think I went through a couple of decisions made over the past few years by the committee. The decision around Mosebenzi Zwane, he was found to have breached the code for various instances of egregious unethical conduct. This is conduct not relating to the freighted dairy or issues at ESCOM or anything like that. So it's not connected to the conduct that we complained of. And so the committee also can't say that they've already dealt with the complaint, our complaint against him, but I'm digressing here. So he was suspended from parliamentary process and duties for a year, and he was only fined 5 days' salary. So it seems that he's now going to have a year suspended pay, I think that's astounding. He also had to issue apologies. On 15th November 2022, Pinky Kekana received a decision against her from the committee. She was accused of receiving kickbacks. Her reasons seem to be lacking in justification for the money she received. But again, it's not possible to really evaluate her reasons because on her request, most of the information was kept confidential. So there's no, we can't really delve further into that. The committee only recommended that she be reprimanded by the House. That's it. On 28 March 2019, Tabang Makwetla was found to have breached the code. He didn't disclose his registrable interests, and he allowed a company that was contracted to his department, which is the Department of Correctional Services, to conduct work at his private residence, which was not paid for. He was fined 30 days' salary, which I think is the highest I've seen, and made to issue an apology. He was not suspended or sanctioned further than that. So the Constitution doesn't allow an MP to be disqualified or removed from Parliament unless they are, there are various instances, but most relevant to misconduct is they have to be found guilty of a criminal offence in the previous 5 years and sentenced to a jail term of more than a year. So the committee can't just kick people out, but they should be able to impose greater sanctions than they do, and perhaps the code should be amended in this regard. Then the code is we think unconstitutional. It doesn't allow for openness, transparency, efficiency, responsible governance, and procedural fairness, all of which are constitutional obligations and constitutional rights. There's a lack of reasons, and it allows for excessive delays. Here's our recommendations. I think there's something wrong with this because it seems to have just copied and pasted the one thing here. But I think I'd like to focus on this recommendation here. This is a quote from the Zondo Commission, from the State Capture Report. Basically, he states that perhaps it is time for South Africa to ensure that its public representatives fulfill their obligations by introducing a form of sanction for what may be termed constitutional and political malpractice. And perhaps the Ethics Committee is not the right place for this, but perhaps it is as well. I mean, I think I can see that the committee could be made more robust, that the code could be made more robust, and could be, the constitutional and political malpractice could form a separate breach in the code, which could carry higher sanctions. I'm not sure, and I'd love to hear more about from Sabelo. I saw in your presentation that they are looking into including something like a mandatory accountability. I'm not sure what that term means, but perhaps it could be linked to this. Yeah. And yeah. So I think that's my presentation. I think we'll open up for questions and discussion at the end. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I was told I was going to respond to the two previous people, so I didn't prepare anything for you. You'd be very pleased to know, because I'm sure you're sick and tired of PowerPoints by now. So I really just want to make a few, hopefully, provocative comments. It's not Parliament bashing, Amoira, but I think a critical appraisal of Parliament's response is necessary. But I want to start with a couple of anecdotes. You spoke about Ben Chirok earlier, and I'd known and worked with Ben from the late 1980s. So as I was coming here this morning and in this gloomy weather, it reminded me of Saturday mornings in London in the late 1980s, going to regional political committee meetings at the IFAA offices in London back then, in the East End of London. So it brought back those memories. And also, you made reference to this project. And I remember Ben calling me just before he died to tell me very excitedly about this project that was about to be launched, and that he wanted CASAC to be involved in it. And so I'm pleased in that regard to be here, to be a part of this process, of this project that meant so much to Ben. And so I'm grateful to that. I was also chatting to Fasila earlier, and we both worked at Parliament from 1994. For those of you who don't know, I was the Special Assistant to the Speaker of the National Assembly in the first Parliament. And one of the funny things was that when we first arrived there, Parliament being the kind of insular body that it was, they had their own in-house software system called Xyrite that they used for Hansard and all of their documents. And none of us that came from the real world understood anything about the software thing. It was incredibly difficult to navigate. So one of the first struggles that Frenny and I had was to try and convince them that they needed to enter the real world and start using Word, or I think it was Word Perfect back then. It was long before Mr. Gates came onto the scene. But it really tells a story about Parliament, because that pre-94 Parliament was so insular that having an in-house software system made sense to them, because by all accounts it actually worked very well in terms of transcribing Hansard and so on, but it was unable to communicate with the outside world. But that wasn't their interest, because they didn't communicate with the outside world, so it didn't matter that their documents were in a format that nobody else could understand or read. But I think, just thought of that, and it sort of, there was a bit of resonance there about, a fundamental shift in what Parliament saw itself as pre-94 and what we expect of it now. Joseph has spoken about the issues of transparency and accountability, which I think are critical, and, I'm obviously very grateful to Sabelo for providing that detailed insight of the Parliament's response to the Zondo Commission. So that tomorrow will be the first anniversary of the handover of the final reports to the President, the 22nd of June 2022. And I know Moira wanted to have this event tomorrow, but I persuaded her to move it. So apologies for that. But it is a year, and one has to ask the question, what has happened in that year? And the answer, unfortunately, has to be very, very little. Fazila spoke earlier about, political will. And I think Sabelo, one of his first slides, talked about urgency. Those are both lacking. I mean, what we've seen from Parliament, and I read that 31-page report on the ATC yesterday, and it's very mechanical. It's a mechanical, process-driven response from Parliament. There's no urgency. This is, probably one of the most important reports. TRC report is probably there. that has come out in a democratic South Africa. And the political leadership is not taking it seriously now, whether it be Parliament or the executive. You know, the President tabled his response to Parliament in October last year, and again, as Sabelo indicated there, the progress has been very, very slow. You know, we were supposed to have a draft bill on whistleblowing by the end of March, I think. Still waiting. One of the, you know, the simple recommendations of Zondo was, you know, or the President's response to Zondo, rather, was we will establish the investigating directorate as a permanent entity. That bill, as far as I know, is still sitting in Cabinet. Hasn't reached Parliament yet. So if you're going to, you know, implement the recommendations of Zondo, and particularly in relation to the law enforcement aspect and the prosecutions and so on, the investigating directorate are saying very clearly that they are hampered by the fact that they're not a permanent body. They can't recruit staff. Their hands are basically tied. And that's an urgent issue in terms of the prosecutions, which would maybe avoid organizations like Unite Behind from having to pursue people through the Parliamentary Ethics Committee when they should be actually in court facing criminal charges. So I think, you know, that underwhelming or that mechanical response, I think, is really worrying. And, you know, we all know we're already in the election cycle for next year. Nothing's going to happen between now and next year in Parliament. Nothing. You know, we'll just go through the motions with the can being kicked down the road and very little action taking place. And what I would have expected was at least a clear signal from the political leadership of Parliament, from the presiding officers, to really stamp their authority and say, you know, this report of Zondo makes Parliament look really bad. And it does. Anyone that reads that report, you know, aside from the Guptas and the other villains, you know, the biggest culprit in state capture was that building over there, was Parliament. Their failure, and Zondo spells it out very clearly. What did Parliament do, he asked, consistently. And interestingly, I was at a News 24 on the record thing that he did last year in September, I think. And he gave the keynote address there, and the comments he made there was rhetorical, I think, where he said, if this were to happen now, would Parliament act any differently? And we got our answer, because when there was a call for a parliamentary committee to be established to look into ESCOM, the ANC said no. So nothing's changed. You know, there's no political will to do anything differently. They don't seem to understand or accept the magnitude of the problem, and hoping that that it will simply go away. So I think you know, the political leadership in Parliament needs to also be called to account, and not just the structures, you know, the various committees that they've set up, and you know, this goes to the Rules Committee and so on. But there's got to be political accountability from the institution in terms of the response. You know, CASAC made a quite detailed written submissions to Zondo, primarily focusing on Parliament and its failures. At a systematic level, we didn't go into the detail of which committee failed to do what, because other submissions dealt with that. But we gave a sort of overarching submission, and was subsequently called to give oral evidence to Zondo, which I did at some point. I can't remember exactly when it was. But interestingly, two other members of the CASAC Advisory Council, Professor Hugh Corder and Richard Calland, were also asked to give oral evidence to Zondo, specifically on Parliament. And Joseph mentioned just now the whole issue of a mandatory accountability, and that's something that emanates from the infamous Corder report, which was actually done while I was still at Parliament. That's how long ago that was done. And which formed part of CASAC's written submission to Zondo, and it does get repeated there. So I think, you know, there are a couple of things that come out from the summary of the recommendations that Sabelo spoke to, which actually were part of CASAC submissions, and the two in particular was the issue of opposition members of parliament chairing portfolio committees and select committees. You know, that's a practice that happens in other parliaments. You know, the majority party will retain its majority on the committee, but the chair is from a different party. And there was a recent example, I'm not sure what that committee was called, in the House of Commons in the UK, that looked at the issue of the former Prime Minister recently, of Johnson, which was chaired by a veteran Labour MP, Harriet Harman. A member of the Labour Party chaired that committee with the Conservative majority and came out with a unanimous report. You know, so it shows that it can work. And, you know, one of the interesting things was that, you know, in terms of the other sort of slam dunk recommendation from Zondo that should have been is a dedicated committee to oversee the presidency. You know, there's no rocket science behind that. We need that. I mean, you know, the Lady R saga recently, you know, just you know, amplifies the need for a committee like that. And yet what Parliament is doing is going to visit the UK, where they don't have a president, by the way. Yeah. So why they're going to the UK, I have no idea. Yes, they are going to France, and they do have a president, so that's fine. But if you're going to go to the UK and study something, go and study how opposition MPs chair committees, because there you might learn something. So it's, you know, again, it's an example of this mechanical response to say, we're trying to show you we're doing something, but actually you're not doing anything, because the minute you begin to scratch beneath the surface, you see that there's no real purpose to that. I'm going to come back to the issue of electoral reform, because that's my real bugbear, so I'm going to end with that. But the other issue that I wanted to highlight is this issue about the resourcing of Parliament. And I think we would all accept that committees need more resources, and they need more dedicated resources to be able to do their jobs properly. But I don't think it's just a question of getting more money from Treasury, especially given the fiscal climate we're in. I think Parliament needs to conduct a review of its current budget, because there's a lot of fat there. And it needs to take a long, hard look as to whether it is using the resources that it has to properly execute its mandate, or whether there can't be a reallocation of budget within what is already provided to Parliament to do what is required. It's very easy to simply ask for more money and then blame Treasury because they don't give you the money. So I think and this comes back to the issue of political leadership. How is this institution being run? Coming back to the issue of opposition chairs, I think the other thing which doesn't come out in the Zondo report, but it's a point that I made to Zondo, was a part of the thing, the sort of culture that has changed in Parliament, and this hasn't been recent, I think it's been since 2014, Fasila will tell me if I'm wrong, where I think prior to 2014, there was also within the presidium of presiding officers, there was always someone from an opposition party. And this was something that I recall very well, because it was a very specific and deliberate thing that Freni put into place in 94, was that this is a parliament of the people. So two things that she did. One was to insist that every party, and we were fortunate in 94, we only had 7 parties, but that every party had to have a front bench in the National Assembly. Because it says when people watch on TV, they want to see their representatives are being treated properly and accorded a proper status. Whether they have one seat or 200 seats, it doesn't matter. That was the first thing. The second thing was around, we need opposition MPs as part of this presidium. So even after the government of national unity ended in 96, and Badra Ranchod left as deputy speaker to be replaced by Balak Mbete, there were other people from the IFP and other parties that formed part, whether they were house chairs or whatever roles they played. And I used to be responsible for the schedule of who presided in the House, and would always make sure that there was an adequate representation of opposition MPs to give the sense that this is a parliament of the people. We're all a part, because it is a political party system. What's happened since 2014 is that the ANC dominates everything, and it's become this institution where debate is not had. The will of the ANC carries the day all the time, And can we really say that the institution is executing its constitutional mandate as the national forum for debate of issues of importance? I don't think it does. So, those are some of the things that I think that begin to undermine the credibility and integrity of the institution. So along with all of the recommendations that Zondo has made in regard to what Parliament needs to do in terms of its oversight and all of those things, but some of these other things go hand in glove with that. And that's without even touching on the issue, for example, of the conduct of the EFF in Parliament in terms of its disruption, its orchestrated disruption of debates in the National Assembly or SONAs or whatever. Parliament needs to find a solution to that, and there's no indication that there's serious debate happening about how do we deal with this. Just a couple more things on appointments. One of the I think you spoke about specifically appointments relating to law enforcement agencies, and that I think emanated largely from the submission that was made by Corruption Watch and the Institute for Security Studies. But there's also the broader issue of the appointment processes for heads of Chapter 9 institutions. Is it Unite Behind that's challenging the Gender Commission one? No, some civil society organization. Corruption Watch is challenging the appointment of the recent appointment of commissioners to the Gender Commission. The process for appointing the next public protector has just commenced. And those of us who followed the 2016 process in detail will recall the problems with that process. It was great at one level. There was huge levels of transparency. It was very open. Interviews were televised and all of that. Some of us had to sit there till 3 o'clock in the morning. The interviews went from 8 in the morning till 3 o'clock the next morning. It was open and transparent, but it wasn't robust. There were, for example, there's a simple thing. Anybody that's involved in recruitment and human resources would tell you need to have a set of objective criteria that you measure each of your candidates against. There was no such thing. So it was political horse trading. I'll have these 3 on the short list, but if you have those 3, can I have these 2? That's how parties negotiated in that process, in the shortlisting process. And the report from that ad hoc committee, one of their recommendations was that Parliament needed to look at this issue of criteria. 7 years have passed, nothing's been done. We're embarking on a new process and we don't have criteria still. So, I'm just highlighting some of those weaknesses. Perhaps just one other, just on Joseph's issue around the ethics committee. We've actually had a successful complaint dealt with by the Ethics Committee. In April 2021, during the JSC interviews, you might recall there was the Malema took on Judge Matojane, who had sat in on the case of an EFF case involving Trevor Manuel, where he awarded them 500,000 rands damages. And Malema proceeded during the course of Judge Matajane's interview to question him about that judgment, even though the matter was at that time on appeal to the Constitutional Court. And the Chief Justice, or what was then the Deputy or Acting Chief Justice, was part of the panel at the JSC. So it was wholly inappropriate. CASAC lodged a complaint with the Ethics Committee in May of 2021. And like you said, we didn't hear anything until the report was tabled in the National Assembly, I think in December 2021. And the decision was that he should apologize to Parliament as well as to Judge Matajane. Malema, of course, at that point woke up because he obviously probably thought that nothing was going to happen with the complaint. And his response to the committee was half-hearted. And it's only now by reading the court papers in the matter, because it's now before court, that I've got a sense of what the exchanges were at the time, because, as you say, they were not made public then. But it showed that the system can and does work at times, but it's inconsistent. And certainly, I think the issue of penalties is something that, or sanction, that needs to be looked at. So the issue of electoral reform, which I want to end on. So I think, it's clear why Zondo went to the extent of commenting on the issue of electoral reform, and not just because Kasek put it on the table for him, but because I think he saw the way that the party system creates this, or facilitates the manner in which Parliament currently operates, without accountability, following the party line on issues. Unfortunately, by the time that his report came out in the middle of last year, there was already a Constitutional Court judgment from June 2020 saying that the electoral system needed to be changed, albeit in a very narrow way, to accommodate independent candidates. So that's a process that's going to be ongoing, but I think it does highlight the importance of an electoral system that seeks to hold, or has the ability to hold, elected representatives more accountable. But I also want to end perhaps on the point that Fazila made, is that whatever electoral system you choose, it's not going to make any difference if we don't change our political culture, both internally within political parties and within society as a whole, as to how we engage in the participatory democracy that our Constitution affords us. So I think it's obviously going to be another process, again, as Sabelo highlighted, of the electoral reform consultation panel that's going to be constituted, and which will, if it does its work properly, will make more considered recommendations about a real and more meaningful changes to the electoral system ahead of the 2029 elections. But I think the issue of the Zondo Commission is, yes, there's a real level of urgency which we're not seeing in terms of Parliament or the executive response to it. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be left once again to civil society organizations to keep these issues alive in the public mind, because it's quite easy to forget and to revert to those old bad habits that created the conditions for state capture to happen.